I'm going to hand over to Professor Penelope Crossley, who is Professor of Law at University of Sydney Law School, and she gave a fabulous presentation, which is so relevant to this. It's fantastic that she could spare some time, and it's also not 100%, so really great that Penelope, you can join us to share your inspiration and insights into this. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to share my slides if that is okay. Right. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is about DER integration and how we need to regulate for it. As everyone is well aware, we've got an electricity law and a set of electricity rules, both in Western Australia, but also in other parts of the country, which are really fundamentally predicated on large fossil fuel generation. And now we're transitioning, and particularly Western Australia is transitioning very, very fast. This is an area where you are clearly leading. And so what we were doing in this research is trying to figure out what are some lessons from international best practice, but also from jurisdictions within Australia, such as Western Australia, that we can learn from. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that today I am on the land of the Darug people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to any elders past or present, and just acknowledge that I'm on unceded land. So the research that we conducted, we initially studied 8 key jurisdictions, and then Peter turned around and said to me, where's Western Australia in this? You need to be looking at Western Australia, which we did. And she was right. Of course, we should have looked at Western Australia because Western Australia has got a lot of these learnings. And actually, one of the things that struck us when we did look at Western Australia was in terms of some of these key areas that we looked at. So we looked at how various jurisdictions define DER, what are their technical standards in terms of both setting but also governance, what is the transparency of DER data, connecting DER to the distribution network, and conditions imposed on DER exports and tariffs. Is that actually a lot of these problems had become quite obvious in Project Symphony. And so some of the recommendations that we had reached the same conclusion on from our research beautifully married up with a lot of those Project Symphony recommendations as well. So I don't need to tell you that Western Australia has got extraordinarily high uptake of DER and is doing some really exciting work around VPPs. One of the things that I'm also working on, just as a side, because I think it's going to be relevant to your broader project, is I'm spending a lot of time also thinking about how we regulate the end of life and also secondhand markets, repair markets, and then recycling at end of life, which is a very difficult economic proposition. So one of the arguments that I'm making is that even though we've accepted that DER is increasingly becoming mainstream, and certainly within the NEM, we're expecting it to be 45% of all electricity by 2050, the governance architecture has really struggled to keep pace, and that we've got regulatory coordination failures occurring, not just within the NEM, but across jurisdictions and across functions. So I'm going to briefly cover 4 key lessons that we learned. The first one is to define DER with purpose. Now, in the NEM, it's a bit of a mishmash. So in the National Electricity Rules, for example, you can see that you need to know that an aggregator is an integrated resource system. Well, it's actually an integrated resource system provider. And you need to know that you're dealing with small generating units. One of the things that we found when we looked at Western Australia is that actually you use the word aggregation, which is already a winner in our mind, but also your rules, we think, better actually represent what is required by the market and what the market needs. One of the things that was interesting, though, is that the limit of less than 10 megawatts varied quite significantly by jurisdiction. And that was an interesting point of difference. The second key lesson, and I'm happy to go through, I've got copious detail. We're about to put out an article, hopefully, on all of this. The second key issue that we found was that building a fit-for-purpose technical standards architecture proves really quite difficult. So in Germany, they have technical standards that are set by an industry body, and then they've got a regulator that then provides governance over it. One of the challenges that we've found is that in some jurisdictions, they're combining both the technical standard setting function and the compliance function. And in some jurisdictions, that makes a lot of sense and it works really effectively. But what we found is that there really needs to be a bit of a check and balance on that power, and also some oversight over technical standards infrastructure. One of the further challenges that we found is that, particularly in Australia, we love an Australian standard, and Australian standards are actually quite difficult because A, they're not publicly available generally, though apparently you can actually request a copy from the various entities that embed them into legislation. But we've got that constant challenge of, you know, how do you actually reform a standard? If the standard gets embedded into legislation, what does it mean? Who's actually responsible for that process and how quickly can they move? The third challenge, and we saw this, and this came out very clearly from Project Symphony and has been picked up both by the Nelson NEM review, but also in Project Jupiter, was about the challenge of how to unlock market participation and best permit value stacking. So one of the challenges that we know is that for a long time, particularly if you're financing DER, which is a problem that I've been banging on about for about 10 years, historically, because DER was deemed to be, and storage in particular, was deemed to be a generation asset, it meant that you're essentially providing a whole stack of services into the market for free, and you couldn't finance off the full extent of the value chain. We now see growing acceptance that actually we need to enable that value stacking, but we need to do it in a sensible way, particularly for VPPs. That means that we're not adding layer upon layer of regulation. And so one of the challenges is when you do have DERs, how can we actually enable them to best optimize their value stack whilst also making the rules easy to comply with? So you can see here, I apologize. In the US, they have FERC Order 2222. They set a minimum requirement for 100 kilowatts for DER aggregations. They've got very clear rules around DER aggregators as a market participant. And what they've done is they've actually designed a series of different tariffs that consumers can opt into that provide different levels of compensation depending on the level of flexibility that the consumers are willing to provide. One of the biggest challenges for us in all of this is actually around consumer information and consumer knowledge, which becomes challenging. Equally, from Project Symphony, one of the things that you can see is that there were a lot of findings that are directly relevant to this research. So things like, you know, if you actually enabled value stacking, you can alleviate the system costs, alleviate local network constraints, support system security. But one of the key findings was that policy and market reforms were essential to scale DER orchestration and reduce barriers to entry. Now, one of the things that was a key recommendation in that regard, which I'll pick up in the next lesson, is around transparency and data, because we can't obviously, it's very hard to use what we don't know exists. And so one of the problems has always been that a lot of our DER have not been visible. And so the work around the DER data hub to extend the Western Australia DER register is obviously going to be critical in that regard. But things that we saw that have been very successful are things like real-time market data, not placing any minimum limit on data being collected. So, for example, you can buy a solar panel from IKEA in Germany, and that's a plug-and-play solar panel that you put on your balcony, and that has to go onto the German data register. So you don't have that same level of invisibility. Going forward, obviously Project Jupiter is exciting because it enables all new DER to connect to a VPP. So what we're really anticipating here is that actually Western Australia will be leading the way in VPP development. Where I'm particularly interested in seeing where that goes is around cybersecurity. So an area that I think Australia has typically done quite poorly in with DER integration into the market is around cybersecurity. the fact that we're relying on voluntary guidelines when other jurisdictions have had very clear cybersecurity guidelines in place now for a long time and actually regulated for a long time is problematic. For example, you could go on the DOE in the US website today and do a whole stack of DER cybersecurity. And the FBI actually has revealed that there was a challenge where they had to intervene into the DER market in the US in 2019 because of an attempt to hack. So going forward, the point I wanted to make here, and I'm very happy to share, we've got a whole stack of data across these 9 jurisdictions. We've got lots and lots of, we've pulled all the various rules. We've got views on who does what best. Clearly the Germans do this best. The Germans make it really easy. There's no manual inputs of data. Everything is very, very easy to access. There's a lot of transparency in the data that's available. It's available much more broadly than other jurisdictions. But that data is anonymized and access to sensitive information is obviously restricted. So that's kind of my 10-minute overview of some of the challenges we've seen across the markets. The good news is, I mean, if you want a case for optimism and you're in Western Australia, you have every reason to be optimistic about DER integration and the work that you've done on VPPs. It's very apparent to us that Western Australia has done a lot of the heavy lifting for the rest of the country in terms of those learnings, and that is full credit to the researchers who are heavily engaged in that. So kudos to you. You've done a great job, and the rest of the country is looking forward to learning from you.
Thanks, Penelope. I'm sure what you've just said will make many people on this call quite happy, and I know Jai Thomas will be very pleased to hear that. I'll make sure he's not on the call, but I'll let him know. But obviously we've got many people, or someone on the call who are involved in Project Jupiter as well as a Curtin, so that's good to hear. And I think your study is just so comprehensive. We can't wait to see it all when it comes out and read the article. So we'll be definitely send it our way so we can promote it. I just wanted to open up to see if anyone's got a question for Penelope based on what she's presented here to start off before we go to the breakout rooms.
Penelope, I have a question. I haven't popped my hand in the air. In terms of just any of the sticking points that you've seen in rolling out governance, etc., how long do you think it's going to take to iron out any of those things before we can go into full production, on DER, with cars, with everything in the mix?
I think the biggest challenge in all of this is the fact that we keep tinkering with our legislation. And so, I mean, clearly, if you were designing an energy law fit for the 21st century, you wouldn't have it as it currently stands. But because it's deemed to be too politically difficult to actually amend and start from scratch, we're constantly doing piecemeal changes, which I don't think actually leads to optimal market outcomes. That's obviously a highly controversial view. It's one that I will kind of take to the day I die, that we could be doing this a lot better. But I think if you fix up the data piece as an initial first step, that fixes up a lot of the other problems. I think at the moment, the fact that, we've got a lot of DR on our networks, that is dumb. It hasn't been interoperable. We haven't had the low voltage data. We haven't had the visibility about what's behind the meter. That clearly needs to change. It's not going to work.
Thanks, Dave. It doesn't really make sense in this day of so much information, right? That we can't actually be transparent around it. And I suppose there's always this interaction with government-owned entities or government, what they're happy to share or not share or whichever, but it just seems like such an opportunity. Any further questions? Otherwise, we're happy to move you to breakout rooms.
Andreas has a question.
Yeah, I had a question. One of the interesting things about...
Sorry, can we just... it's probably best to use the raise hand because there was 2 people there, but if you could introduce yourself and then ask the question, and then I'll go to the next one. So who was that? Sorry.
That was me. I think I did raise my hand.
Sorry, I can't see it. Sorry. Who's talking? Sorry.
Andreas.
Okay, sorry, Andreas, over to you. Yep, go.
Thanks for that, Penelope. That was fascinating. What I wanted to ask about is this sort of approach to DER of the customer and markets, and trying to get that relationship right when it's a very different type of infrastructure. In Europe, I've seen there are a few community energy initiatives that are mostly sort of driven by communities and collective ownership. I wondered if there is legislative support for that kind of thing, because I know it's relatively difficult in some jurisdictions, and this extends to water provision as well. And so that kind of community ownership of resources and assets, is that something that exists in Australia? Is there legislative support, or is there a framework around that? And how does that factor into these sort of broader aspirations about DER?
We've certainly had a number of regulatory sandbox trials where people have been trying different community models. We've had community models, particularly around wind, which have been quite successful. And then you've also got the challenge where the community may have had less of an option to choose, that they might be going into a community model. I'm thinking about Broken Hill in New South Wales, where I suspect we'll island them off and just say, actually, it doesn't make sense to be providing you with such a long, stringy piece of grid that actually doesn't have a lot of communities along it. So there are certainly options there. The main problem within the NEM is that aggregation is not properly legally recognised, and VPPs aren't properly legally recognised at the moment, which is why I think we're all looking with great interest at Project Jupiter to see how that does get incorporated and how that's done properly. The other challenge that we're seeing is that we've had a lot of, just with my consumer protection hat on, one of the challenges that we have seen is that consumers have often not fully understood their participation in a VPP. And so in some of my other capacities where I do get consumer complaints about DER, one of the challenges that we've seen is that education piece really needs to be done by government, and it needs to be done well, and it hasn't been done all that well to date. So.
Thanks. Sorry, Andreas, I wasn't on the right screen, so it was my fault that I didn't see your hand up, so I apologise. We might save your voice, Penelope, and send people to breakout rooms, and then we'll come back after that. So thank you. We've got a couple of questions there for you when you go into those. Thanks.